The bull that had sent grown men to the hospital now bowed his head before a scarred dog. The crowd fell silent, not because of what they saw, but because of what they felt. This wasn't training, it wasn't luck, and it certainly wasn't normal. A child stood between them, barely 8 years old, not saying a word, and yet, somehow, commanding the moment like it had been written into his soul. Before we begin this unforgettable story, would you mind sharing where you're from in the comments? And if stories of love, loyalty, and second chances move you. Please give this video a like and consider subscribing. The sky above Red Hollow Ranch sagged with the weight of early snow clouds, casting the rolling pastures of western Montana in a pale, cold light. October had sharpened the wind, and frost had begun to crust along the tops of the wooden fence rails. The Bitterroot Mountains loomed in the distance, silent sentinels watching over a land that had once thrived on routine, but now felt charged with tension. At the heart of that tension stood Goliath, the Brahman bull. He was monstrous in both size and presence, nearly a ton of trembling muscle, with a hump that rippled with each step and eyes that flickered between rage and madness. His gray-black hide, once clean and proud, now bore patches of dried mud and splinters from broken fencing. For the past 2 months, Goliath had been a problem no man could solve. He had turned after Boone, the ranch's livestock manager. Disappeared without a trace, Boone had been with the ranch for nearly 10 years, quiet, steady, the kind of man who knew every animal's temperament by heart. He had walked into the south pasture one morning to inspect the fencing and never returned. Search parties found nothing. Goliath had changed from the moment Boone vanished, as if his absence had broken something deep within the bull's understanding of the world. Now, the bull charged anything that moved. He'd gored a fence post clean through last week and shattered a steel trough the week before. He paced his enclosure like a beast tasting the edge of madness, his hooves digging trenches in the dirt. Frank Harlan, owner of Red Hollow Ranch, stood at the fence, one hand resting on the rail, the other buried in the pocket of his canvas coat. A man in his late 50s. Frank had the lean build of a life outdoors, and a face weathered by more than just wind and sun. He didn't speak much, and when he did, it was with the weight of someone who had buried both a wife and a dream. He watched Goliath in silence, jaw tight, breath rising in cold puffs. The bull slammed his horns against the reinforced gate again, sending a shudder through the rails. Frank flinched just slightly, but said nothing, inside the open barn behind him. Something moved quietly. Scout, the ranch's German shepherd, lay stretched out in the shadows, his head resting on his paws. His coat was sable with streaks of tan along the legs and face, and his ears stood erect, alert to every shift in the air. 5 years old. He had once been part of a mountain rescue unit in Washington State, but that had been before the avalanche, the one he'd been pulled from alive, but with a shattered hip and no survivor to bring home. Since then, Scout had grown withdrawn. He never barked at strangers. He didn't fetch or play, he simply watched. Now, he watched Goliath. The bull's tantrum continued, snorting, pawing, ramming the gate, but Scout remained still, ears twitching only slightly. He didn't growl, didn't move. His gaze was fixed on the massive animal, reading it the way only a trained mind could. He'd been like that for days, while ranch hands kept their distance, too afraid to even toss hay into the enclosure. Scout sat just outside the barn, sometimes for hours, silent and unmoving. He never crossed the fence, never barked to assert dominance. He simply observed, Frank had noticed. He turned slightly now. Glancing back toward the barn, Scout lifted his head just an inch. Their eyes met. The dog's tail did not wag. Frank didn't call him over. There was an understanding between them. Wounded things recognized one another. A gust of wind swept across the corral, stirring dead leaves and the sour smell of churned-up earth. Goliath lowered his head again and rammed the gate with a snort that echoed like a thunderclap. The metal groaned. Frank sighed. They couldn't keep him. Not like this. The vet had warned them. The insurers had called twice. The neighbors were nervous. One more incident and they'd be forced to put the bull down. He stared at the beast for another minute, then turned back toward the barn. Scout had already lowered his head again, returning to his vigil. "Damn animal's gone crazy," Frank muttered to himself, "and the only thing watching him's a dog that don't even bark." Snow began to fall. Not thick, but steady, brushing the landscape in white, somewhere far off. A hawk screamed against the quiet, but here at Red Hollow Ranch, there was only silence, breath, and the relentless pacing of a bull who had lost something, and a dog who might have understood that loss all too well. The wind had shifted overnight. By morning, the snow had stopped, leaving a fine, crystalline dust over the fields of Red Hollow Ranch. The sky had softened from steel gray to a gentler silver, and for the first time in weeks, a cautious stillness hovered in the air. It was into this tentative calm that a dusty government sedan crunched its way down the gravel path toward the farmhouse. Frank Harlan stood on the porch, arms folded tightly across his chest, shoulders tense. He'd gotten the call from the county office of child welfare 3 days earlier, and though he had tried to refuse repeatedly, it hadn't mattered. Family, no matter how distant, was family. The car rolled to a stop, and a tall woman stepped out, wrapping her scarf tightly against the morning chill. Claire Redding, a social worker in her early 40s, was the kind of woman who carried the weariness of her profession in her posture. Slightly stooped from years of bad motel chairs and late-night emergency calls, her long brown hair was pulled into a loose bun, wisps escaping in the breeze. She wore minimal makeup, if any, and her brown slacks and sensible shoes were both streaked with road dust. She was efficient but not unkind, the sort who balanced empathy with formality out of self-preservation. Claire opened the back door, and Eli emerged. The boy was 8, though he looked younger, thin as a reed and pale from months spent indoors. His hair was a tousled, wheat-colored mess, and his clothes hung loosely on his frame, a hand-me-down hoodie 2 sizes too big and jeans fraying at the cuffs. He held a small duffel bag, faded blue with a broken zipper. His eyes, wide and hazel, scanned the ranch without expression, though there was something ancient in their stillness. Claire placed a hand gently on his back. "Go on, sweetheart. This is Mr. Harlan." Frank didn't move from the porch. "You didn't say he was this young." Claire gave him a look. "He's your late wife's cousin's boy. There's no one else, just until we find a long-term placement." "Which means never," Frank muttered, then sighed. "Come on." Then Eli walked forward without a word, each step careful, like the earth might shift beneath him. Claire offered Frank a folder of paperwork. "He's been quiet, withdrawn. You'll need patience. His parents died in a fire. House collapsed. He was found hiding under a table." Frank blinked. "When, 6 months ago, he hasn't said much since." Claire crouched in front of the boy. "Eli, I'll call to check in next week. All right? You be brave." The boy gave a small nod. Claire stood, exchanged a last look with Frank, then got back in the car and drove away. dust spiraling in her wake, inside the house. Cheryl Duncan had already set a place at the kitchen table. Eli sat silently, eyes flickering between the steaming plate of eggs and the unfamiliar hands that had placed it before him. Scout sat in the hallway, half in shadow. Watching, Cheryl offered a hesitant smile. "You eat what you can. Honey, no one's going to make you talk." Eli looked at Scout. The dog's ears twitched, but he didn't move. The boy held his gaze for longer than he had looked at either adult. Then, slowly, he picked up his fork and began to eat, that afternoon. Frank busied himself with stall repairs while Cheryl showed Eli to a small room at the back of the house. It was sparse but clean. A narrow bed, a wooden desk, a small window that looked out onto the paddock. Scout had followed them as far as the stairs, then stopped, watching as Eli climbed up with hesitant steps. He didn't whine, didn't bark, just waited, still and alert. The following morning, the ranch fell into its usual rhythm. Frank fed the horses. Cheryl swept the porch. Scout vanished toward the barn. As he always did, Eli, left to his own silence, sat by the window and watched the snow melt in slow rivulets down the glass. But by mid-morning, the boy was gone. Cheryl had just finished hanging laundry when she noticed the side gate swinging open. Panic tightened in her chest. "Frank," she shouted. Rushing toward the fence line, Frank came sprinting from the stables, and together they scanned the fields until Cheryl pointed with a shaking hand. There, Eli stood just outside Goliath's enclosure, no more than 6 feet from the reinforced fence. The bull was at the far end of the paddock, tossing his head and snorting at the disturbance. Scout was already there. He stood between Eli and the fence, motionless, tail low, body relaxed but ready. His eyes flicked between the boy and the bull. Frank cursed under his breath and started toward them, but Cheryl caught his arm. "Wait," she whispered. Eli took a step forward. Goliath snorted, pawed the earth, but didn't charge. His ears turned slightly forward, tracking the boy's movement. Then the bull shifted his weight. Frank tensed, but before Goliath could move, Scout stepped sideways, slowly but deliberately, placing himself squarely in the bull's line of sight. He didn't growl, he didn't bare teeth, he simply stared. Goliath froze. It was the kind of moment that seemed to stretch the air itself. For a full 5 seconds, the bull held Scout's gaze, then slowly, visibly, relaxed his shoulders. His hooves stilled. His head dipped slightly, Eli unaware of the drama behind him. Stepped to the fence and reached out a hand. He didn't speak, he didn't flinch, he simply waited. Goliath stared at him, chest heaving. Then the bull took a step forward and stopped. Scout didn't move, neither did Eli. Goliath's massive head leaned slightly toward the fence rail. He huffed. Then, in a gesture no one would have believed possible, he lowered his muzzle until it hovered just inches from Eli's outstretched fingers. Frank and Cheryl stood frozen. Scout finally looked back at Frank, not expectantly, but as if to say, "This is where it starts." By the third morning, the frost on the grass lingered well past sunrise, clinging stubbornly to the brittle, yellow blades like memory clings to grief. The fields of Red Hollow Ranch glowed faintly under the low Montana sun. The air filled with the gentle creak of branches and the distant crackle of melting ice. A new rhythm was beginning to settle into the quiet bones of the ranch, one built not on routine, but on quiet observation and tentative trust. Eli was already dressed when Frank shuffled down the stairs. The boy sat silently on the back steps. hoodie zipped to his chin, a slice of bread in his hand. He stared out toward the paddock, where Goliath was visible in the distance. Grazing in slow arcs beneath the frost-bitten cottonwoods, Scout sat beside him, alert but relaxed, his ears gently twitching with the wind. Frank scratched the back of his neck. "You're up early." Eli gave a tiny nod, then reached down and scratched behind Scout's ear. The dog leaned into the touch. It was the most affection anyone had seen Scout accept since he came to the ranch. By the time the sun climbed higher, Cheryl had set out a warm flask of milk for Eli, wrapped in a faded hand-knitted sleeve she'd dug up from the pantry. The child had become part of the place faster than anyone expected, slipping into the rhythms of Red Hollow without disrupting them. He rarely spoke, but he was always watching and learning. That morning, like the one before it. Scout rose first and padded toward Goliath's pen. Eli followed, boots crunching softly on the frosted earth, hands tucked in his sleeves. Frank watched from the porch, arms crossed, heart uncertain. Goliath didn't pace any more. He stood still when he saw them approach, his massive head lifting slowly, nostrils flaring to catch the boy's scent. Scout stopped a few yards from the fence and sat down. He didn't bark, didn't whine. Instead, he lowered his body until he lay flat on the cold earth, chin resting between his paws, gaze steady on the bull. Eli copied the gesture, kneeling just behind Scout, and Goliath watched them. Then, to Frank's disbelief, the bull lowered himself too, not all the way, not as a dog would, but with his front legs bending slightly, his head bowing lower toward the ground. It wasn't submission. It was something else, mimicry, curiosity, recognition. That pattern continued for the next several days, every morning. Scout would lead. He would walk the same route along the edge of the field, slow and deliberate. Eli would follow without words. Like a shadow, they would stop just short of the fence, and Scout would perform simple actions, sitting, lying down, rolling slightly onto his side, small things, measured things. Goliath began to mimic them. At first, it was awkward. A step forward here, a twitch of the head there, but over time, his pacing ceased. He waited for the boy and the dog. He anticipated them, and when Eli reached out his hand now, the bull leaned into it, nudging the small palm with the softness of his muzzle. From a distance, Benny Craig, the newest ranch hand, watched through narrowed eyes. A young man in his late 20s. Benny was tall, lean, with shaggy dark hair tucked under a torn beanie. He had a nervous energy about him, always tapping something, fingers, feet, teeth, and rarely spoke unless pressed. Benny had joined Red Hollow just a few weeks prior, after bouncing through temp jobs from Idaho to Wyoming. His criminal record was clean, but Frank could tell he carried something in his chest that hadn't healed right. Now, Benny leaned against the barn post and muttered, "Never seen anything like it." Frank grunted, "Me neither. You ever trained that dog? Nope. He came trained, to teach a bull, though." Benny asked, incredulous, "That dog's something else." Frank didn't respond. He didn't want to admit what was forming in his own mind. That Scout wasn't just teaching. He was remembering how to be calm, and in doing so, showing Goliath the way, that Eli, silent, broken Eli, was the center of it all, back in the paddock. Eli crouched beside the fence. Scout had begun making low, soft rumbles, barely audible whines that carried just enough tone to draw attention without threat. It was the same kind of sound he once used when searching for survivors beneath rubble. Goliath responded by lowering his ears gently, flicking his tail once, and settling down into a quiet stand. No stamping, no snorting. Scout had taught Goliath something that no human could: how to be still. That afternoon, while Eli napped on the old couch in the sitting room, Scout lay beside him, chest rising and falling with quiet rhythm. Goliath stood in his pen, facing the window that looked into the house. He didn't move. He just stood there, eyes soft, breathing slow, as if waiting for the boy's return. For the first time in months, Frank allowed himself to hope. The wind returned with teeth that morning, slicing through the bare trees and rattling the loose window panes of the old farmhouse. A storm had passed overnight, leaving the earth soaked and softened, the sky a sullen gray, and puddles mirrored with clouds. Frank Harlan sat at the kitchen table nursing a cup of bitter coffee, his eyes drifting to the coat rack where Eli's too large rain jacket hung limply beside Scout's leash, unused, as usual. Eli was upstairs, sketching in a spiral notebook Frank had found at the general store. Most pages were filled with simple shapes: fences, barns, trees, but lately, there had been detailed drawings of Goliath's eyes, Scout's paw prints, and one image of all three of them standing together beneath a cottonwood tree. Frank had said nothing, but he kept that one page folded in his wallet. In the next room, Cheryl Duncan rustled through an old cedar chest. She was looking for winter curtains when she stumbled upon a leather-bound photo album, dusty and nearly forgotten. She carried it back to the kitchen, a wistful smile on her face. "Remember these?" she asked, sliding it across the table. Frank glanced down. The first photo was from a summer fair, years ago, back when Lorna was still alive. The ranch had hosted a community fundraiser, a day of horseshoe tossing, lemonade stands, and hayrides for families from the city. Frank hadn't looked at these images in years. Then Cheryl paused, fingers trembling slightly. "Oh," she whispered. "Frank, look." She turned the page. There, frozen in time, was a boy no older than 3, holding a red apple out to a calf with large ears and a nervous gaze. "That's Goliath," Frank muttered. "And that," Cheryl said, voice thinning, "is Eli." Frank's breath caught. He leaned in. The boy's face was unmistakable, round-cheeked, sun-dappled, with the same light brown eyes and unkempt hair. "They came to the fair from Billings," Cheryl said softly. "Lorna invited underprivileged families to visit the ranch every summer. I remember his mother. Her name was Holly. Quiet, polite, single mom, sweet kid." Frank stared at the photo. It wasn't just a coincidence. Goliath and Eli had met before. The connection they shared wasn't some magical fluke. It was memory, buried deep and called forward by scent, posture, voice, recognition, before either of them could speak again. A knock came at the front door. 3 hard raps. Frank rose, cautious. Standing on the porch was Dr. Henry Jacobs, tall and thin, with salt and pepper hair combed severely back and wire-rimmed glasses perched on a long, straight nose. He wore a navy trench coat that hadn't seen dirt in years and carried a slim briefcase. Every inch of him exuded authority, controlled, intellectual, and cold. "Mr. Harlan," he greeted curtly. "I'm Dr. Jacobs from the Montana Department of Animal Welfare and Behavioral Psychology. I was informed of an unusual situation here." Frank narrowed his eyes. "Who informed you? I can't disclose sources," Jacobs replied, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. "There are concerns about a child interacting unsupervised with a large, previously aggressive animal, particularly given the documented violence of the bull in question." Scout appeared silently in the doorway, body stiff, ears forward. Jacobs hesitated. "Is this animal secure?" "He's smarter than you," Cheryl muttered from the kitchen. "Scout's part of the family," Frank said flatly, "and the situation's under control." Jacobs turned. "I'll need to observe interactions between the child and the bull, and interview the child, alone." "No," Frank replied instantly. "You'll observe, but you won't put him under a microscope." "Very well, I'll make my own determinations." Jacobs set down his briefcase and opened a folder, pulling out printed reports, annotated behavioral assessments, and even satellite photos of Red Hollow. The man had done his homework. Later that afternoon, Jacobs stood beside Frank and Cheryl by the paddock. Eli approached, holding a small plastic bucket filled with diced apples. Scout walked ahead, pausing at the gate. Then, giving a soft chuff, Goliath stirred, but didn't charge. He watched. Eli opened the gate and stepped inside, with the Scout just behind. The boy walked slowly, arms relaxed, steps practiced. Goliath lowered his head slightly, a twitch in his shoulder, but no movement forward. Then, just as the boy drew near, Goliath took one large, deliberate step toward him. Jacobs stiffened. "He's going to lunge." Frank raised a hand. "Wait." Eli didn't flinch. Scout moved forward and half a step, not barking, not snarling, simply placing himself at Eli's side. Eyes locked on the bull. His posture was calm but unmistakable. A line had been drawn. Goliath froze. He snorted once, then shifted his weight back, his head bowing slightly. Eli reached into the bucket and held out an apple slice. The bull took it gently from his hand. Jacobs was silent for a long time. "That dog," he said finally, "appears to be moderating the bull's behavior. He's been teaching him how to be calm," Cheryl said, "day after day." Jacobs adjusted his glasses. "Dogs can influence livestock, but this is borderline anthropomorphic." Frank shook his head. "Call it whatever you want. It's real that night." As the fire crackled in the hearth and Jacobs reviewed his notes, he asked to see the photo from the fair. Frank handed it over. Jacobs stared. "This changes the context." He admitted, "It explains why they connected so fast." Frank said they weren't strangers. Jacobs was quiet for a while. Then, reluctantly, he nodded. "I'll need to observe more, but I admit this situation warrants further study." Scout, lying nearby, lifted his head. His eyes met Frank's. A flicker of trust passed between them. Unspoken, but understood. They held the meeting in the old hay barn. There wasn't much choice. The town hall in Copper Bend was too far, and besides, everyone agreed this story didn't belong in a courtroom with polished floors and wooden benches. It belonged here, among the dust and timber beams, under the gentle sway of haylofts and old pulleys that hadn't moved in decades. The barn smelled of earth and animals, and the benches were just hay bales pushed into uneven rows. There were nearly 30 people in attendance. Neighbors, county officials, social workers, a few curious reporters from Missoula. They came not just to observe, but to decide what would become of the boy who had tamed the monster, or, as some whispered, the boy who had been tamed by one. Eli stood in the center, wearing a clean white shirt that hung loosely over his frame, sleeves rolled clumsily to the elbows. His hair was combed for once. Though it still curled slightly at the ends, he had a small card in his hand, words scrawled in uneven block letters. He glanced at it, then at the crowd, then back at the card. His lips parted as if to speak, but no sound came. Scout sat at his feet, motionless. Frank stood to the side, arms crossed, jaw tight, his gaze shifting between the boy and the crowd. Cheryl, beside him, held her hands in front of her apron like a prayer. At the far end, Dr. Henry Jacobs stood with a notepad tucked under one arm, impassive, his spectacles catching the dull barn light. Eli began, his voice cracked. I don't want to leave. He stopped. His hands trembled slightly. He looked at Frank, then at Cheryl. His eyes found Scout. The dog was still, waiting. Then, almost imperceptibly, Scout stood up and walked forward. There was no command, no prompting. He stepped ahead of Eli and sat right in the center of the barn aisle, between the boy and the people. His body faced forward, but his head turned, slowly, toward the open barn door, from beyond the threshold. Goliath appeared. The bull's massive form filled the doorway, his hooves silent against the soft earth. His head was low, not in aggression, but in a strange kind of reverence. He walked slowly, deliberately, not the way he had charged before, but like something ancient approaching a shrine. The crowd instinctively tensed. Some standing, one of the county officials, a man named Cal Ramsey, took half a step back. Cal was built like a sack of gravel, short, stocky, mid-50s, with a perpetual scowl born of bureaucracy. Is that animal restrained? He barked. No, Frank said. He doesn't need to be. Goliath came to a stop just a few feet from Scout. The dog remained seated, unmoved. Eli stood behind him, a single hand resting on the back of Scout's neck. And then, without drama or noise, Goliath lowered his head further until his enormous muzzle brushed against Scout's shoulder. He stayed there, breathing in slow huffs, eyes half closed. A bull who had once rammed steel gates now sat with his weight distributed evenly, his tail still, his shoulders relaxed. A murmur passed through the barn. Not words, just breath. Dr. Jacobs adjusted his glasses slowly. His pen dropped to his side. Eli stepped forward, his voice clearer now. He's not scary, he's just scared, like I was. Scout showed him how not to be. The room was quiet. Eli continued. I don't know how to say all the things I feel, but this place, it's the first place that didn't look at me like I was broken. I'm not trying to be special, I'm just trying to stay where I feel safe. Goliath let out a deep, low breath, almost a sigh, and nudged Scout once more before stepping back. Scout looked up at the boy, then turned to face the crowd. His ears flicked forward. His tail swayed once, low, steady, calm, and in that moment, no one in the barn doubted what had just happened. Dr. Jacobs cleared his throat. He stepped forward slowly, his face unreadable. I came here expecting to make a recommendation, he said. But it seems the recommendation has already been made by someone more qualified than I am. He looked at Scout, then at Goliath, then back to Eli. I withdraw my objection. Frank exhaled, long and hard, the tension in his shoulders melting. Later that week, the paperwork was finalized. Eli Carter became Eli Harlan. Scout stayed close through it all, like he always had. Never leading, never following, just being there, steady and silent. And Goliath. He no longer paced. He stood at the edge of the paddock each morning, waiting not for food, but for the boy, the dog, and the quiet that had saved him. Sometimes, healing doesn't come with noise. It doesn't arrive with flashing lights or grand miracles. Sometimes, healing walks on 4 legs, stands quietly in the cold, and teaches a broken soul how to breathe again. Scout didn't bark, Goliath didn't speak, and Eli barely said a word. But somehow, through the silence, God was speaking the loudest. This story reminds us that miracles often come wrapped in the most unexpected forms. A wounded dog, a silent child, a once feared beast. It's proof that what the world calls lost God can still redeem. And when we choose to love, even when it's hard, we become part of something divine. Maybe you've felt broken like Goliath, guarded like Scout, or alone like Eli. If so, remember, grace still reaches the forgotten, and healing still finds the humble. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who needs hope today. Comment below and type Amen if you believe that even in silence. God is still working. Don't forget to subscribe for more stories of love, redemption, and the quiet power of faith. May God bless you and everyone who watches.